Welcome everyone. It is great to have you all with us for London Climate Action Week. My name is Jessica Priest and I'm the Exec Chair at Accounting for Sustainability, A4S. Today we're going to be focusing on operationalising net zero and in particular transition plans. And I'm really pleased that A4S is hosting today's event in partnership with ICAEW. Please note that we are recording the webinar and it will be made available afterwards on A4S's YouTube channel. And there are two key objectives that we want to deep dive into, in particular, looking at the steps that are going to be key for delivering net zero commitments, including how to finance the transition to net zero and the different ways that you can engage with your value chain. And the second is really thinking about the way that transition plans need to be underpinned also by consideration of nature and people. What we're going to be doing throughout is having a few poll questions, so please do answer those polls, and particularly if you did want to get CPE points from the session today, then you do need to complete those. We're going to hear from three great speakers. From Gregor at SSE, the CFO at SSE, Jennifer from Barclays, and Richard from ICAEW. Now, please do throughout the webinar use the chat function to post any questions that you have, and we'll do our best to answer these. And the webinar will be about 1 hour long. I think, as we all know, it's critical that we accelerate the pace of change on climate action. And in the build up to the Glasgow COP, a lot of organisations made net zero commitments, and everyone is now really focused on how do you turn commitment into action. A net zero transition plan is a really important way of providing that structure, the clear steps and the practical actions that are needed to go from commitment to action across a range of areas, and it can help you to set interim targets and track progress against these targets. And it's really important that that transition plan is credible. It's something that investors are increasingly looking for, and regulators are starting to build into the disclosure requirements. If you look at the recent launch of the International Sustainability Standards Board on Monday at the start of Climate Week, you can see transition plan and some of the requirements that are emerging. And I'm really pleased to get us going to introduce the first of our speakers, Jennifer Bell from Barclays. Jennifer is the Vice President of Climate Strategy at Barclays. She represents the bank on multiple groups, including the Transition Plan Task Force. She co-leads the Net Zero Banking Alliance, Autos and Trucking Working Group, and WBCSD's Banking for Impact on Climate in Agriculture. Before joining Barclays, she spent 7 years establishing the Bank of England's approach to climate risks and led its early thinking on nature risks, working as an advisor for Mark Carney, supporting him as a private finance advisor for COP26. So huge wealth of experience, Jennifer. It's really great to have you with us.
Thanks, Jessica. Great to be here.
So if I could start, so Barclays and other banks and maybe drawing on the breadth of experience that you have, one of the key challenges is how to finance the transition. You say a little bit about Barclays' own approach, how you're thinking about what transition means for Barclays, what it means for your overall strategy and your approach to lending and indeed investment.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a bank, our significant influence on climate and also the transition to net zero is coming from the financing that we provide to the real economy. So as Barclays, we set out our ambition to be a net zero bank a few years ago, and we have split our approach into 3 areas. The first is reducing our financed emissions, so reducing the emissions that our clients are producing and helping them to reduce that in a way that sort of supports the transition. The second pillar is scaling up our financing for the transition, so providing the necessary sustainable finance to our clients so that they can develop the solutions and the tools and the things necessary that we'll need in a net zero world. And then the last pillar is our net zero in our operations. So it's not an area I'll focus much on today because it's very much a small proportion of our impact on climate in the world compared to the vastly bigger impact from our financing. So to the first one, we committed to aligning our financing with the Paris Agreement. And so this overarching goal sort of is across our whole business as a bank. And the way we've gone about trying to implement that is breaking it down into smaller pieces and nearer term timeframes. So net zero by 2050 is a very long way away. And it's interesting, I saw some of the responses already on the polls about sort of this mammoth task of trying to address sort of the transition to net zero. So we've looked at, and many banks have done this, sort of sector by sector approaches and setting targets out to 2025 and 2030 to give us the nearer term goals to look for and much sort of closer targets to try and implement with our clients. So we've prioritized the highest carbon sectors as those are the ones that obviously need to transition the fastest. And we've set targets across energy, power, cement, steel, and autos. And so we've looked at each of those sectors and our clients in that sector. We've looked at, for example, what the IEA says needs to happen in that sector in order to transition to net zero. We've selected this pathway, mapped our clients against it, and sort of been able to set a target that we know is based on a science-based, credible pathway to net zero. So, for example, in our energy book, we've done all of that and seen that the financed emissions in our energy portfolio need to reduce 40% by 2030. And we set that target a couple of years ago across both our lending, but also our capital markets book as well, because we need to encompass the broad range of financing that we provide to the real economy. And we're doing quite well on that target. So we've reduced already 32%. So we're well on our way to meeting the 40% by 2030. The second pillar I'll also talk to, so I spoke about sort of needing to scale up financing whilst we sort of scale down financed emissions. So we can't just get to net zero by reducing emissions. We also need to develop and support the activities that need to happen and the new technologies that will need to exist for us to work as we do now, but just in a net zero way. So it's very important to ensure things like the clean technologies, the infrastructure are all there and they get the financing that they need, sort of advisory, education and broader support that we as a bank can provide to the real economy. So last year we set out a target to provide $1 trillion worth of sustainable and transition financing by 2030 to a broad range of sectors. So this includes financing to green, to social, to transition and sustainability linked activities. And we already have a sustainable finance framework, which we've published and sets out what is eligible as a sustainable piece of financing according to our own definitions, building on the work that a lot of external bodies have done. And we're building on that sustainable finance framework by developing a transition finance framework. I think a lot of people have spoken before, and I certainly have when I was at the Bank of England and also working on COP26, that you can't get to net zero by just financing green. Those things do need financing, but we also need to support companies and activities that at the moment are not green, but are on their way to doing so, or are transition activities that are sort of driving what we need to happen in the near term, potentially not out to 2050. And so under our transition finance framework, we'll look to define what that means in practice across a range of sectors so that we can help to channel our sort of target amount of money towards those activities as well. And in addition to that target, another area of work we're doing under our sort of financing of the transition pillar is that we're looking at sort of the types of companies that might not have access to traditional financial markets. So a lot of the future clean tech that's needed for transition is currently being developed by sort of smaller startups that maybe need a slightly different type of support than these sort of larger companies and corporates. And so this led us to set up our sustainable impact capital portfolio several years ago. And we invest our own capital as Barclays into those companies. And there are really exciting initiatives and ventures that are in that portfolio that we get to work with on a day-to-day basis. And last year, we raised our ambition on what we want to fund through that portfolio as well. So we set a target to invest £500 million of our own money into those global tech startups by the end of 2027. So we expect in that portfolio, we have a next phase of investments looking at things like what are the technologies that can enable the transition. So things like carbon capture, hydrogen technologies, and things that at the moment are relatively nascent but need funding to make sure they can scale up at the pace necessary to drive the transition. So sort of summarize that in terms of a bank's role in the transition is very much the dual approach of sort of scaling down the emissions that are happening in the higher carbon sectors and supporting those customers to transition in a way that's aligned to net zero, and then scaling up on the low carbon side. So we make sure that we have the infrastructure, the tools, the technologies that are needed for the world to get to net zero.
And just building on that, when it comes to business customers, and I'll after you we'll come to Gregor and we can look at it from the corporate perspective as well. But from a bank's perspective, what would you look for in a credible transition plan? Because of course, when you are lending, and looking at your own transition, it is all dependent on your customers and what they're doing. So can you give people a bit of an idea of the things that they should be thinking about when they're disclosing and presenting to their banks and investors?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, our transition is a reflection of our clients' transition. So we pay very close attention to the developing transition plans that are being put out there by our clients, and they can provide a wealth of information that we find really useful to sort of evaluate how our clients are currently doing on the transition and where they expect to go as well. And so we look for every client in a sector that we've set a target for. We have performed an assessment on those clients, and we do that every year under our client transition framework. And that allows us to sort of rate our clients from a scale of 1 to 5. And we look at things like quantitative metrics. So obviously emissions are really key here. Where are their emissions now? Where have their emissions been in the last few years? And where are their emissions predicted to go in terms of the targets that they're setting, both near term and longer term? And those align to the scenarios that we've looked at for net zero in that sector. But what's really important is to go beyond just the emissions and get under the hood really and see what can we delve into in terms of the credibility of some of those targets. And that's where we're finding that really that's where the magic is in terms of trying to get these assessments of our clients. And it's looking at things like, has the board approved the target or the transition plan? And is their executive compensation linked to that achievement of that target? That's when you really start to think this is probably going to get delivered if we can see that link. But then other indicators as well that show that it's a transition plan is really embedded into strategy and not just something that's produced by a function sort of that's not necessarily embedded across the organization as a whole. So it's things like, is that company using the low carbon tech that they need to be using if that sector is going to get to net zero? Or have they backed up their plan with really clear CapEx, OpEx plans that is sort of green financing that's going to the right activities across the piece? And we also ran a pilot last year that looked at some broader indicators, so things like just transition, trying to get a sense of whether companies are starting work there. That was a pilot because it's a much earlier stage than a lot of the other sort of climate-focused indicators, but it was useful for us to start to get a sense of what are our clients doing in the just transition element as well. And if I just flag a couple of statistics that we pulled out from those pieces of assessments, which I think really demonstrates why it's important to go not just to the quantitative target base, but also to look more qualitative as well, is we found that of all the clients that we reviewed across that first year of assessments, 80% around about had a climate target of some form, which seems pretty good. But then we looked as well at which clients have tied executive compensation to the achievement of a climate goal, and that was at 60%. So there's clearly a gap between those that are setting the targets and those that are really fully embedding that within sort of the incentives for their seniors. And so as we went through this process of sort of reviewing clients and doing this over the spectrum of sectors, what really became apparent though is that we are actually missing a lot of data and a lot of granularity that we would love to see. So we did sort of first year, last year of reviews and learned a lot. We got a lot of interesting information out there, but this gap in terms of transition plans not yet being fully sort of operationalized and being able to put them out in great granular detail in terms of our approach definitely sort of held us back, and we're doing another year of sort of review, refresh. We've updated our framework, we engaged a consultancy to help us improve it and refine it, and that will hopefully, once it's sort of properly up and running, allow us to have a lot more confidence in the results. And then we're going to really start to roll this out across lots of decision making across the organization. So we'll be able to think about other uses for these assessments. So not just gauging where our clients are on the transition on a client by client basis, but also being able to put that into other broader decision making pieces, like identifying prioritized areas for client engagement, for instance, or maybe capital allocation, possibly even things like scenario analysis. So there's lots of use for these sorts of things, but we just need the data to really be there to allow us to make sort of robust assessments that we can then rely on across the business.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the point in the poll earlier of data being one of the remaining key challenges, not the only one, but a really important one. Now, I'll come to Gregor next, but there's one final question that I just want to put to you, and coming from the chat from the audience, maybe you could clarify a little bit. So in terms of, you were talking about Barclays and how you've defined what is sustainable, how does that relate to different standards or definitions? You've obviously got things like the EU taxonomy, and the question is, does that mean that, you know, each organization in the finance sector is creating its own definition? Isn't there a common standard and common definitions of what sustainable is?
That's a great question, and I wish there was a common standard of what sustainable is. The EU taxonomy obviously is probably the most well known of the taxonomies for defining sustainable. What we found is it's very EU focused. It's tied very closely to the NDCs that the EU has, which is fantastic in the EU, but we are a global business and we have a much broader reach than just the EU. So for us, we wanted something that was consistent across our book, and we could apply sort of consistent definitions across the regions that we operate in. And at the moment, there isn't a sort of really well-developed global standard for what sustainable means. And so we thought we'd take it upon ourselves to set out our own. And also we could set that out in a way that we felt reflected our broader strategy and tied into that in more detail as well. I think in a perfect world, it would be much neater if everybody could follow the same definitions. I'm sure many corporates would agree that are trying to look at the sort of definitions of sustainable finance that all of their various sort of counterparties are using. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. And I think many times I've heard sort of Sarah Breeden at the Bank of England and others say, you know, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And we felt can't wait around for these sort of perfect definitions to exist, and just need to sort of get going. And it's a similar thing to, you know, the client transition framework I was just talking about. That's effectively our in-house rating system. We could have used an ESG rating provider, but we actually felt that building up these frameworks ourselves and having this expertise internally to be able to undertake these assessments or do the definitions ourselves for the sustainable finance framework, for instance, these really give us invaluable pieces of expertise and sort of learnings from doing that actually can help us more broadly as we apply our strategy.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. I think lots of things there to dig into. I'm going to turn now to Gregor to bring in the corporate perspective and that of a CFO. So Gregor has been with SSE for 25 years, and he's a member of SSE's board with responsibility for finance, investor relations, risk, audit, insurance, procurement, logistics, IT, and corporate business services. So a pretty broad portfolio, Gregor. He from an AFRIS perspective, he's also been involved in our work as a founding member of our CFO Leadership Network, which was 10 years ago now. So being a real leader, looking at the role that the CFO and the finance team can play in achieving a sustainable business. So Gregor, I'd like to just explore a little bit more that perspective of the CFO and the finance team. When we did the poll at the beginning, there were definitely a few challenge areas that people had. One was just, thinking about how to get started in developing a transition plan and setting that transition plan. There were also, of course, data gaps, which Jennifer was just touching on a little bit there, but also how to link the organization's overall strategy and financial planning processes with the transition plan so that it doesn't sit as something separate. So I'd like to start with you talking about how, as a CFO and your finance team, you've looked at particularly that link between the overall kind of capital investment that you might be doing and the financing that you require. How are you really building that into the organization's strategy and the kind of decisions that you're taking, particularly as an organization really at the heart of the transition from a UK economy perspective?
Okay, morning everyone. So although I'm in charge of IT and have about 600 people reporting into me on IT, unfortunately with Zoom sometimes it's a bit difficult again. So good morning from very wet and dreary London. Actually, I'm in London today. I was in Frankfurt yesterday. So I'll just say a bit about our general approach at SSE, and then I'll talk about the specifics, if that's okay, Jessica. I mean, clearly, we have a very clear purpose at SSE to provide the energy needed today while providing a better world of energy tomorrow. That's very simple. But what it means is that we need to transition from fossil fuels into that kind of great clean renewable strategy, and we're very much focused on developing, building and operating and investing actually in critical infrastructure. We've been on this journey for more than a decade. It's probably 15 years. I've been finance director 21 years with the company. We go back to 2012. We were one of the largest carbon emitters in the UK. We emitted 25 million tonnes. We're now at 6 million tonnes. Now, no one's forced us to do that. We've done it because our purpose and our drive. So the one thing, I'd say is, yes, we need to get standards and we need to get comparators, but we also need to have, boards need to have that focus to drive forward and do the right thing, which SSE has been really very much at the forefront. We've got a plan for net zero. That's why we produced a net zero transition plan in March 22, and that sets out clearly to all our stakeholders the 17 key actions that we are taking forward to meet our climate targets. And that's scope 1, 2 and 3. And I think by 2040, scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions will have dealt with, and for the remaining scope 3, which as everyone knows is more challenging, by 2050. I mean, we've got a huge ambitious plan, and finance is really at the forefront of that. And we just announced in May an update to our plan that we put to the market 18 months ago. We call it the NZAP. 18 months ago, we now call it the NZAP Plus, and it's NZAP on steroids, because we're going to increase our capital expenditure over the next 5 years from 12.5 billion to 18 billion. So that's a 40% increase in the space of 18 months on our projections. And 90% of that CapEx is for net zero initiatives. And SSE is right across the value chain on those initiatives. Our transmission business is enabling all the green energy in the north of Scotland to be transmitted into where the demand is, into England and Wales. And we've got about 10 very large projects, HVDC cables coming from the north into the south. We're building huge amount of renewables, the largest offshore wind farm in the world, Dogger Bank, 3,600 megawatts. And we've also got one of the largest pump storage facilities that we're looking to build at Corrie Glass in the Great Glen. So some great initiatives in all of this, and in our thermal business, transitioning to low carbon capture, and ultimately hydrogen, which will be the really clean fuel. So that is really aligning us to that kind of 1.5 degree target. And I think for finance, you know, the key thing for us is making sure that we have a clear measurement of what we're kind of aiming to target. Some in capital appraisal, you know, it's not just the old days of looking at pounds and pennies. It's looking at value and what does it do to our plan, and do we need to accelerate that plan to meet what our stakeholders are looking for. So I always say this, but sustainability is actually not something that we have as a clear objective. It's one of our values, and it's been one of our values for the last 15 years. So it's embedded within the finance team and how they look at things.
And are there just one or two top tips that you'd have if you sort of roll back time and look at that question of how somebody should get started? I mean, clearly, if 90% of your capital investment is focused on that transition, that's clearly the same as the you know, the organization-wide strategy. So you can really see how embedded it is. But for somebody who is just getting started, what are some of the first steps you would recommend taking?
Well, you've got to bring your stakeholders with you. I mean, that's clear. So we're a quoted company. We need to bring our investors with us. But there's a wide spectrum of views, and you know, I have to talk to our investors, fund managers that are our top 30 investors, not, you know, some of the smaller investors that keep pushing their position. And I look at you know, sustainable fund managers like Mike Fox at Royal London, who've been around. They bring a pragmatic solution to it. So bring those stakeholders with you. I think that's the key thing. Believe in what you're doing with those stakeholders. Government and regulators for us are really important because policy needs to be driven forward. But also we need to be bold. The problem with regulators and government is that they take time to make decisions, and we don't have time. So when I have to deal with detailed bird survey issues in offshore wind, when we know net zero is really a critical factor because of some technicalities, that's an issue. So bring government regulators. Customers clearly for us are really important, and they're at the heart of transition to net zero. And although we don't have a domestic customer business, we interface to customers, particularly in our distribution businesses in the UK, and in Ireland we do have a domestic customer business, so that's really important to get the technology there. What I would say overall, when you're looking at how you take people with you, is you need to kind of look at collaborating, sharing ideas. And I think one of the great things that I've found being part of the CFO network at A4S is that we've shared fantastic kind of solutions, and we've come up with, I think, some great publications. You know, I remember way back in the early days, Jessica, you were in a kind of committee with me. We were looking at the Vili Denny sustainability issues there, and how we do capital appraisal for visual kind of amenity and these type of things. So I think that sharing of knowledge is really important, and that can be industry specific, but it can also be on a more generic basis, and I think that works really well. So that would be my main tips. But my final tip would be, boards have to want to do this. You know, we've got regulators kind of pushing fairly detailed technical solutions, and they will take too long. Boards need to be part of this because ultimately the stakeholders will demand it. And if boards don't take that on, and finance teams are really a big part of that, then we will fail in our ambitions. So it has to be in the heart, because ultimately, if we're on this journey and trajectory, it will ultimately be good for business, because SSE, for example, has a huge amount of growth in all its businesses because of that purpose. That purpose that we looked at 10, 15 years ago, really reshaping the business. So that's what I would, those are the tips I would give you.
Yeah, and we can certainly share in the chat a link to all of the guidance that we've created over the years and that the CFO teams have inputted to, and I think it covers some of those really practical areas that you've touched on. I mean, some of it is how to engage with your investors and others. Some of it is, building on your example of Yuli Delhi, how to build into the strategy process, the budgeting process, the CapEx processes, how to get the right management information in place. So we'll send a link to that in the chat, and it's got lots of those case studies in there. Just one final question, Gregor, and this is something Jennifer touched on, that they were looking at from a Barclays perspective of starting to look at what the just transition meant, and how they could assess the companies that they're lending and investing in around not just the climate dimension of how they're transitioning, but how they're thinking about people as part of the transition. Now, I know that's something that SSE has done a lot of thinking on. So can you share just a few headline thoughts on how you've gone about thinking of the development of a just transition strategy?
So look, we've been very much at the heart of it. Just transition, our Chief Sustainability Officer, Rachel McEwen, came up with a kind of great principle of publishing a just transition strategy. We were the first company in the world to do that in November 20. That strategy is made up of 20 principles, and it kind of helps us consider and address the trade-offs of transitioning into a net zero world and transitioning out of a high carbon world, which for all of us is a really difficult choice, and particularly in our sector, because the S in ESG, that social, that's about keeping the lights on, and we will have to make difficult choices at some stage if we haven't accelerated our net zero plans, and government have to accept that. So the plan considers 4 key stakeholder groups that we identified that are impacted by that transition. So that's workers, customers, communities, and the supply chain. And what we did was we took that approach to just transition, we embedded it into our strategy, as it's one of the kind of SSE's 4 core 2030 goals. And those 2030 goals have addressing climate change at their core, and ensuring that's done in a just and fair way, and what creates value to society. Just transition, in my view, the principles have been providing a framework and lens through which we make our decisions on how we move towards net zero. And it's important to try and normalize the principles of a just transition within climate disclosures. I think that's really important. We've incorporated that just transition into our own net zero transition plan, and ensuring that the kind of implications for workers, communities and consumers are considered by including just transition as a cross-cutting issue, plan. But I think most importantly, we're transitioning a huge amount of people from the high carbon industries into our new net zero plan. So over the next 5 years, we're bringing on around about 1,000 people a year. And I would estimate that 25 to 50% of those people coming in will be transitioning out of high carbon into low carbon. I think that's a fantastic kind of message to kind of pass on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gregor. So I'm going to move on to Richard, and Richard is the head of ICAEW's sustainability team, and an individual and organisation that I'm pleased that IFRS has partnered with over a long time. Since IFRS set up its accounting bodies network, which was 15 years ago, and ICAEW is one of those founding members, but had been involved in our work since inception, nearly 20 years ago. Richard has driven a lot of change through his role at ICAEW, including things like establishing the Natural Capital Coalition, which is now the Capitals Coalition, really driving the measurement and embedding natural capital, social capital into decision making. Richard's also involved in the transition plan task force. And so, Richard, maybe I could start there, asking you to say a little bit more about the work of the transition plan task force and the guidance that it's developing, the kind of recommendations and what they might mean for companies and investors in the UK and elsewhere.
Sure, thank you. Well, of course, the Transition Plan Task Force was announced at the Glasgow COP and came off the back of, there was that flurry, wasn't there, of commitments that almost became competition. When can I be net zero, and can I name a date even closer to today than before? And it was wonderful to see that ambition, but it was also that, it has given rise to a lot of greenwashing kind of accusations. And the key thing about the Transition Plan Task Force and the framework is it's about driving the action. It's about saying, so you've made these commitments, you say you're going to do this, well, how are you going to do this? And can you tell the market and other stakeholders how you're going to do that? And I think that's probably going to be something of a reality check, because for many organisations, because of course the people have made commitments and without perhaps first going and saying, well, what does my abatement curve look like? So and then going to look at that, it perhaps makes some of those commitments look too ambitious. But it's very important in terms of that kind of, so how does this happen? And I think the key thing for me about the framework is that it starts where you'd expect, which is to say how are you decarbonising your business, but that really isn't an ambitious enough question. So it embedded in the framework is a kind of three other questions, if you like, which is, what are you doing to help decarbonise the economy? Because of course you could decarbonise your business just by getting rid of all your emitting assets or pushing them into your supply chain. So this framework says, well, that's fine, but that's just a paper. The economy isn't any better. So how have you helped decarbonise the economy? And then, as we've heard from the other two speakers, the element of people and society is very important. So the next sort of question there is, well, have you ensured that in your transition, you've made sure that you've acted in a just way to other people, your communities, your workforce, and other stakeholders? And then lastly, there's the question, well, in transitioning to net zero, are you actually damaging nature more substantially in another way? Are there those kind of unintended outcomes that have happened because you haven't taken consideration of the wider nature? So I think that's the real ambition, or for me that's the really big ask there, and it's hugely ambitious. And I think the last part, I think, in terms of your question there is, everything always used to be aligned. Everything was going to be aligned to something else, and now I think the buzzword is interoperable. but this is there is an important point here, particularly with the sheer number of different frameworks and reporting standards that still exist and the requirements of businesses. How do these interlink? And I think that's another important part of the task force work.
So making sure that the recommendations are consistent with, for example, the disclosure standards that the UK is likely to be mandating over the next couple of years, etc. Yeah.
So the TCFD and in the ISSB standards, the transition plans are referred to, and there's some detail there, but this needs to plug into that. These need to absolutely fit together like a jigsaw.
Yeah, and to Jennifer's point, a lot of businesses, most businesses, in fact, in the UK, whether through their supply chains or through the scale of their business, operate globally, and so having that global consistency is pretty key. Can you say a little bit more? You touched there briefly on referencing nature, and clearly there's been a lot of momentum over the recent year or so around really recognizing that it's important to accelerate understanding and action around biodiversity loss and nature, as well as climate, and the two relate to one another, but of course there are also other drivers of nature loss, but nature can also provide some of the solutions in terms of climate mitigation. So can you say a bit more about the thinking that the Transition Plan Task Force has done there, of linking through how an organisation thinks of their transition plan with some of those considerations of nature and biodiversity, and how an organisation might start to think about some of those issues, if there's a few top tips that you could give?
I mean, that's kind of the $1 million question. I mean, it's spot on. It is you can't really just have a net zero transition plan. And I personally, so this is me, I'm not speaking on behalf of the task force, but my own view is, even if you start with a net zero transition plan, and then you say, how does biodiversity plug into that, which is really where we are with the task force. This is a net zero plan, but we need to think about how does biodiversity fit in, and the big example there is change of land use, is massively connected to emissions, production and abatement, and that's where the work at the task force is now, is how do you focus on carbon but recognize the inputs that nature has through say change of land use, or on the other side through say nature-based solutions being part of the answer. But personally, I don't think it's going to be very. Everything is moving so quickly. I think that quite rapidly, most of these transition plans will become net zero and nature positive transition plans. That they won't be necessarily just the focus on climate. And I think that some of the drivers of that are, as you pointed out, is that at Montreal Kunming COP, we had the global biodiversity framework agreed, and that commits governments to embedding impacts and dependencies of nature into business practice by 2030. I mean, that's not very far away at all. And when you think about how biodiversity is probably way behind climate and in the corporate consciousness, that's a mammoth task. But also the publication of the TNFD framework that's due out. I think that a lot of probably the leading businesses will start by almost crashing together TNFD and TCFD, and I don't think it'll be long before it's just a transition plan to net positive, nature positive, net zero, and ensuring that transition is a just one.
Yeah, and TNFD, the Task Force for Nature Related Financial Disclosures, which they've been piloting the framework and getting iterative feedback from organisations. That's due to be launched in September during as the final sort of framework. So definitely something to look out for if anyone isn't familiar with that. Now, of course, you are at ICAEW, and as Gregor touched on, finance professionals, accountants have a really important role to play. Can you say a little bit more about what you see the role of the accounting profession being, and how finance professionals should be preparing now, both for some of the emerging requirements, but also, as Gregor was saying, not waiting for things to be mandated or regulated, but what they really need to be doing now to help their organization understand and accelerate the kind of actions that they can be taking.
Sure. So I would say that, and I would say this one, that I think that the professional accountant is core to getting this right, because at the heart of this are some very fundamental questions, but points about how do you know where you are? And I think it came up on one in the poll, you know, the where do I begin and where do I get the information? And I think that's sort of part of the skill set of the profession is that point around information and data, and it being structured in the right way, being reliable and decision useful, and that's kind of the kind of core of the profession's craft, if you like. And the interpretation of that and the knowledge that comes out of that is fundamental. And it needs to be through the finance function will become embedded in the organization's thinking. You know, we don't want this to be happening as a sideshow. The transition plan needs to be the plan, and so it needs to be part of the strategy. And how is the business going to finance this, and what are going to, and so it's going to be assessing the financial impacts, but also thinking about new information. So in transition plans, there's not just the thinking through of nature and people and things we call sustainability as risks to the business, which is perhaps more familiar to many, but where people are going to need help is the other side of this that's becoming a very strong part of the narrative, which is, well, what is your impact on the world? And what is your impact on people and society? And how do you start measuring that and getting your arms around it and building that into decision making? That seems to me to be very much what the accountancy profession is all about. So it's the right skill set, but perhaps the profession need more of the content knowledge to address these.
Thanks, Richard. And I know that something that AFRS and ICAEW have been working on is looking at that whole question of capacity building and how do we provide the support to the profession. If I could now, we've got about 10 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is bring Jennifer and Gregor back in as well. And maybe we can just touch on a couple of final takeaways or actions that the audience could be thinking about. Gregor, if I come to you first, you know, what would you see if there's one really key area that you want people to take into account? What would that be in terms of helping them to accelerate progress?
I mean, I probably covered it earlier. I mean, I think that kind of collaboration, listening and sharing learnings, but pragmatic learnings. I mean, I think Richard's point about biodiversity and nature is going to be really important, but we're going to have conflicts, and we're going to have decisions, you know, that you know, not everyone will agree with. You know, what takes the priority? Is it carbon or is it nature? I mean, we're dealing with that day in, day out on our renewables kind of program, you know, in both onshore for peat restoration, for example, and in offshore when we're dealing with the bird species and those type of issues. So I think that those three things are really important. We've got to remember, you know, one company can't achieve the just transition alone, and therefore, you know, we have to bring others with us, and sometimes that's persuading, but sometimes that's a bit push as well. And you know, I think there will be areas, and particularly scope 3 is the tricky area. we can all deal usually with the scope 1 and 2. They're difficult, but we can deal with them. Scope 3 is going to be really difficult, and companies are already making decisions there that will take time to come through. So I think the key message for me is, working with others, sharing ideas and experiences, and being pragmatic. Let's not, I don't want net zero biodiversity to go the same way as IFRS has gone. And Richard, being an accountant, I'm sure is, the back end of accounts are almost unintelligible. We've got to be very careful that when we create all these rules, we're not creating something that doesn't kind of create actions. So I'm a pragmatist. Let's get on with it and deliver.
Yeah. Great. I think Gregor's frozen, but I think that was on the key message. Let's get on with it and deliver. Jennifer, if I could come to you just for a final few thoughts.
We won't get all elaborate. I think that works really well.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Gregor. So Jennifer, if I could ask you the same question, just having heard the other perspectives, is there a key point that you want to reinforce? And then also, which is a much broader question, we had a question earlier around some of the discussion that is really happening in the US around the term ESG and backing away from that, and some of the pushback around ESG, and the question specifically is asking about some of the comments that Larry Fink has recently made. Can you just say, from a Barclays perspective, any thoughts that you might have around the different, and it comes to the terminology question as well that you touched on earlier. So maybe just say a thought on that, and then also really coming back to transition plans, what your key takeaway for everyone would be.
Yeah, it's absolutely true about sort of ESG as a term necessarily not needing to be with us for too long. I actually said myself maybe 5 years ago that I think the ultimate success indicator of those of us working on climate or ESG is that our job titles don't exist in a few years' time. Obviously that's not happened. I'm still here, I've still got climate in my title, but effectively what we need is for ESG or climate or whatever, sustainability, to be embedded within everybody's job. And it literally everybody in every sector, in every department needs to be thinking about these things as part of their day-to-day job. And that's truly where we need to get to. I think we're a long way off that. I was pretty optimistic when I first said that 5 or so years ago. But I think I've heard similar comments from, literally last week, Daniel Hanna, our head of sustainable investing at Barclays, said something similar. It's where we need to get to, but until we're at that point, I think we're a while away. Until we're there, it's important to have people within organizations whose role it is to champion these issues, because otherwise we risk never really driving the change at the pace that we need. In terms of my sort of key takeaways, and I think sort of last pieces of advice, I definitely echo what Gregor was saying about sort of engagement. This is a cross organization effort, a cross sector effort, a cross economy effort. We need to engage with our clients. I've already spoken a little bit about that. We need to engage with others in our industry. You listed some of the groups that I'm involved in during my introduction, and that is literally just a few of the many, many, many groups that Barclays is involved in, because we see such value in coming together with our peers and trying to get some of these thorny issues sorted out and figure out ways to sort of get through all of the different challenges that transitioning to net zero and then thinking about these broader ESG areas involve. But also engagement within your organization is something that I don't think is spoken about quite as much. The fact that this can't be, as I alluded to before, it can't be a transition plan that's made over here by the sustainability team. You need to be talking to your frontline bankers, your finance teams, your risk departments, and that's obviously just finance institution, but the same applies to sort of real economy. And you need also top to bottom engagement. So I was really interested at the beginning, there was a response on the poll about the fact that senior buy-in is one of the biggest barriers to implementing a transition plan. And I think that is a massive challenge to overcome, but a really important one, because you need that tone from the top, because at the end of the day, the key word there is transition. You're shifting the entire business model. And if you don't have the senior buy-in for that, it's really, really going to be an uphill battle to try and implement it. So engagement is basically the thing I would leave everybody with, and that is across a whole range of actors and organizations.
That's actually a really good segue into the final poll that we have, which shares each of the different areas within the transition plan guidance released by the Transition Plan Task Force and GFANZ, which is the global equivalent of the TPT. So it'd be great if people could just click on which of these areas you see yourself or your organization focusing on in the next 6 months around transition planning. So is it around really getting those foundations in place, thinking about your implementation strategy, your engagement strategy, which we were just touching on there, the metrics and targets, or governance? And if you could pick which of those areas you see as the priority area of focus, you may be doing a couple of them in parallel. So if you just pick the one that you would see as the most important. And whilst you're doing that, Richard, maybe I could ask you to just share your final thought as we hit the final in the webinar today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really, just to echo what's already been said, that the important thing is to get going. This is an enormous task, and it's going to be messy and it's going to be difficult. And you know, I think it's that ability to collaborate, but also just to make mistakes and be transparent. And I think in order to facilitate that, there has to be a certain kind of forgiveness from the markets and a bit of forgiveness from the regulators as well. Fantastic.
So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you to Gregor, Richard and Jennifer for sharing such great insights into how to get started around transition plans and some of the areas that the actions you can take to operationalise net zero. So thanks everyone, and look forward to further discussions and seeing all of the actions that flow in this area.